Okay, hello everybody, and welcome. This is Chapter 18, reviewing the sectional struggle, 1848 to 1854. Let's get started. A couple of key points, as always. First of all, this chapter covers some more efforts at compromising on the issue of slavery, the extension of slavery, and these compromises will actually contradict previous efforts to do the same thing. They're based on these true sectional differences that are emerging and becoming very distinct, and expansion and development will sort of reach beyond the continent itself. In fact, Americans will start to look at Asia and Central and South America and even the Caribbean. At the end of the day, you got to realize that America is moving closer to war. So I just want to say that the Whigs and the Democrats are true national parties, and as such, they absorb a lot of tension, in fact, hold the country together. But James K. Polk is ill, and he has committed himself to one term, and so the Democrats in his place will nominate General Lewis Cass. He is a champion of popular sovereignty, which is something that we'll talk about later on in this chapter with Stephen Douglas. But in a basic sense, what it means is that the residents of the territory should have the right to vote as to whether or not slavery will extend into that territory or not. Here is General Cass. Let's look at some of the political triumphs of General Taylor, but first some of the other triumphs. Here is a Triumph Spitfire, a Triumph TR-3A, and a Triumph TR-6. All kidding aside, here is General Taylor, and he's known as the hero of Buena Vista from the Mexican War, but he may not be the right man for the job. He has never held political office. The pageant suggested that he never even voted for president before. And he and all Whigs, for that matter, are really not committing on the issue of slavery altogether. In response to that, the Free Soil Party arose, which specifically was, fighting for the issue of ending the extension of slavery in the territories. So people from different walks of life will become free soilers, and they do run this idea of free soil, free speech, free labor, and free men. And while some may have been high-minded and argued against slavery in a moral or ethical sense, many take a different approach and will say that only with free soil in the West could the American commitment towards upward mobility continue, because slavery in their eyes was detrimental for wage earners. In fact, wage earners were competing with slaves and therefore had less of a chance of owning property. And so the Free Soil Party does run a candidate in 1848, and that is Martin Van Buren. He wins 10% of the popular vote, but the election itself is really between the Whig and Zach Taylor, and the Democrat and Lewis Cass. And you can see that the Whigs do win, and that they have a stronghold of support in the Northeast, whereas the Democrats have more support in the West, the Northwest. And so gold was discovered in California right before the end of the Mexican War, and this issue will actually expose the issue of slavery for President Taylor, as tens of thousands of people go on to California during the gold rush. With that comes a lot of crime and lawlessness in California, and Taylor actually encouraged the California to go ahead and draft a constitution in 1849, which did exclude slavery. And here's a man who's panning for gold. Most people who went out there were actually unsuccessful, as you may know. This would be a very cheap way to get into the business, so to say. Here is a sluice, and you can see that three men are working together, and they're able to actually sift through more dirt more efficiently. But again, they're talking about just looking on the surface here for gold, where most folks just didn't find any. Okay, so let's look at the admission of California as potentially upsetting the sectional balance that existed in the country, and remind ourselves first that President Taylor was a Southerner, and that the South had a majority in the House, and they had equality in the Senate. And so, if California were to come in as a free state, that would upset that balance of 15 slave states, 15 free states, and worse, it could set precedent as to what to do with future territories and states being carved out of the Mexican cession. So Southerners are not thrilled about that, and they're also upset about the proposed abolition of slavery in D.C., and to some extent they are insulted by the Underground Railroad and the success it was having in filtering slaves out of the South and on to freedom in the North. Harriet Tubman, nicknamed Moses, was the most famous of the conductors, and she personally rescued more than 300 slaves. In response to this, Southerners were adamant about a stricter fugitive slave law being passed. Here is Harriet Tubman right here. I have had students in the past who told me they found these strange, sort of corners in their basement or their attic, and they believed them to be, stops along the Underground Railroads, pretty common in older homes. So that's kind of interesting stuff. So at this time, there are some radical Southerners known as fire eaters who are actually speaking of secession, and they plan to meet in Nashville in 1850 to discuss that very point. We should also realize that Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster will appear together for the last time on the public stage, and then really they're going to be hammering out this compromise of 1850. And so we're going to spend some time talking about that in a few. Clay, you know, as the perennial Whig candidate known as the Great Compromiser for his efforts at the Missouri Compromise and the Compromise of 1833. Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois is known as the Little Giant. He plays a very important role as well. John C. Calhoun is on his deathbed. In fact, he dies in 1850. He was too weak to actually speak for himself and had to have his words read by a colleague. And following that, Daniel Webster will take the spotlight, and his 7th of March speech in 1850 will greatly influence Northern opinion. So there are some newcomers to Congress, including William Seward, who later is going to be Secretary of State and actually will be involved with the purchase of Alaska. We'll talk about him down the road. But he's going to start to suggest that legislators, Christian legislators, should actually adhere to God's moral law in addition to the laws of men. And supposedly President Taylor subscribed to this way of thinking as well. And the Pageant actually suggested that the president would veto any kind of compromise on the issue of slavery. And here is Seward. And so obviously it's unfortunate that President Taylor passed away, but when he did and Vice President Millard Fillmore took office, it actually helped the chances of the Compromise of 1850 becoming law, because Millard Fillmore had presided in the Senate over during the debates, and therefore he was familiar with it, and I think he just generally was in favor of it. So once it's signed into law, there still is this difficult process of selling it to the American people. Henry Clay was said to have given 70 speeches or so, and eventually acceptance of this compromise will crystallize in the North. Now in the South, the fire eaters are still talking about secession, but eventually the Southern people do accept this. In fact, they accept it before the fire eaters could convince them otherwise. And here is Millard Fillmore. Now, it's generally believed that the North got the better end of this compromise of 1850. At the end of the day, there's more free states than slave states. The territories of New Mexico and Utah are open to slavery through this popular sovereignty, but they're not necessarily guaranteed to be slave states. Texas does receive $10 million in compensation, but in a real sense is a modest sum. And the slave trade was outlawed in Washington, D.C., but not slavery altogether. The sort of thorn in the side that will be this fugitive slave law, and in fact it does further polarize the sections. So the Pageant says that the fugitive slave law transformed conservative compromise Whigs into abolitionists with true moral zeal, basically overnight. I know Massachusetts, in an all but nullifying act, made it a crime for state officials to enforce the new federal statute. And so it's truly polarizing the sections. Slaves do not have the right to testify on their own behalf. They do not receive a jury trial. And it was said that the federal commissioner who handled the case received $5 if the runaway was set free and $10 if he was not. One thing the Pageant also says that the Compromise of 1850 gave the North time to accumulate the material and moral strength that provided the margin of victory in the Civil War. This map here of the United States pre-Compromise of 1850, you can see that Texas still has a claim to a large piece of land, and that will be gone after the Compromise of 1850, and California will also be admitted as a free state. We do not yet have control of the Gadsden Purchase. We will see that coming up soon enough. Okay, so moving on to the election of 1852, the Democrats nominate Franklin Pierce in New Hampshire, America's second dark horse candidate. He is a pro-Southern Northerner, which will broaden his appeal. And the Whigs will throw their support to General Winfield Scott. You might recall he marched on Mexico City and was a hero of the Mexican War, but was not particularly well liked. So now that the Compromise of 1850 has settled the issue of slavery, at least temporarily, the campaign of 1852 lacked any real substance, and so the Democrats will benefit from the split in the Whig Party along sectional lines, as John P. Hale, a senator from New Hampshire, will run from the Free Soil Party and pull some votes from them. Pierce will win in a landslide as a result of that, and this ultimately marks the end of the Whig Party. And you can see here the success of Pierce. We're back on track with expanding territory to support sectional interests. Southerners are now looking south for territory that would be conducive to the institution of slavery, and their eyes settle on the Caribbean and Central and South America. In fact, a while back, James Polk actually offered to buy Cuba for $100 million, and Spain flat out refused. Now, after this, there is some conflict with Spain. Spanish ships had seized an American steamer called the Black Warrior, and President Pierce was kind of forced to act. So with England and France and Russia occupied with the Crimean War, they wouldn't really be able to help Spain. And the American ministers of Spain, England, and France were sent by Pierce to Ostend, Belgium, and there they drew up a top-secret dispatch known as the Ostend Manifesto. And this recommended that Pierce offer $120 million to Cuba. Now, this leaked to the public, and embarrassingly, the Pierce administration dropped the issue. So now that the U.S. had extended to the Pacific Ocean, they began to look across to Asia. And following the Opium War, Britain had secured trading rights in Cuba, and in particular Hong Kong. And so the United States was looking for some sort of, privileged trading rights just like that. And President Taylor will send Caleb Cushing to China. And while he's there, he's able to secure the Treaty of Wangea. This labeled the United States in the eyes of China as a most favored nation, and provided that Americans accused of crimes in China would be tried by American officials rather than in Chinese courts. Following success in China, Japan was next on the list, and in 1852, President Fillmore sent Matthew C. Perry to Japan. Now, eventually he makes his way to the beach, gives a gift, comes back a year later with 7 man-of-war ships and a large force of men. And then he was able to secure the Treaty of Kanagawa in March of 1854. Now, this secured proper treatment of shipwrecked sailors, American sailors, and it also granted Americans coaling rights in Japan. In addition to that, it established consular relations. So Japan, which had been isolated for 2 centuries, will now be interacting with the Western world, and in fact will quickly industrialize. So a transcontinental railroad is a big deal. Transportation was needed so badly that it was suggested that camels be used in an overland route to bring goods back and forth. And so a railroad would be a nice industrial, efficient link to bring goods and unite the country and encourage settlement and really just do great things. It would also bring great wealth to the territories that it passed through. And so obviously there's a real desire to have it pass through your section. Now, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis of Mississippi arranged to have James Gadsden purchase a sliver of land from Santa Anna for $10 million, who supposedly Santa Anna was again in need of money. And the South would have been a relatively easy place to build the Transcontinental Railroad because it was flat and desert, as opposed to the North, which was not necessarily flat. And also there was several dozen different hostile Native American tribes at any given time. Here's Jefferson Davis, by the way. And this is, of course, the Gadsden Purchase, which I think we've seen in a previous map now. And the proposed route of that southern route, that is, of the Transcontinental Railroad and that green line there. So speaking of personal interests, in 1854, Stephen Douglas pushed the issue of popular sovereignty again. First thing he said was that the Nebraska Territory should be separated into Kansas and Nebraska, and in those territories, slavery could be decided by popular sovereignty, as in a popular vote. Now, of course, this opposes outright the Missouri Compromise, but President Pierce, who was advised by Southerners, supported this fully. It's probably worth saying that Stephen Douglas was quite the speaker, and despite the fact that tensions in Congress were pretty high, he was able to persuade enough people to be on board with this. And there he is, the little giant, not his best picture. And here's a map where you can see that both the Kansas and Nebraska territory are clearly above the 36-30 line established by the Missouri Compromise. So just to wrap this up, the pageant says that the Kansas-Nebraska Act greased the slippery slope of the Civil War. Also, from here on out, the fugitive slave law was all but ignored by Northerners. In fact, Northern abolitionists and Southern fire eaters were further polarized by it. The Democratic Party, although electing the president in 1856, would not do so again for 28 years. I believe it was Grover Cleveland in the 1880s. And instead, a true sectional party, I should say, and the Republican Party emerges, and they do so quite rapidly. They have a strong connection with the Midwest, and in particular Wisconsin and Michigan, and they would not be welcome south of the Mason-Dixon line. That's it for Chapter 18. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions, please post them below or email or just ask me in class. Have a good night.